June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas. Unificia Verger. Burkhart's hand shook slightly as he moved his pencil across the hidden pages of his diary, capturing thoughts that, if uncovered, could have condemned him to solitary confinement at the hands of his own superiors. "The Americans must be deceiving us," he wrote. "No country could sustain such wealth and strength while waging war on two fronts." From the train window, he had seen a vision that tore apart 3 years of Nazi indoctrination. Every farmhouse and street corner gleamed with electric light. Every shop window illuminated as if stars had descended to scatter across the Texas plains, at 10 o'clock at night, no less. In Germany, blackout rules had shrouded entire cities in darkness since 1940, and even before the war, only about 20% of rural farms had power. Yet here, in a land Nazi propaganda had long painted as decadent and crumbling, electricity poured forth as if it were an inexhaustible river. Then came the disembarkation. 150 men of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, stepping not from cattle cars or freight wagons, but from cushioned Pullman coaches equipped with dining rooms and sleeping berths. The townspeople of Mexia, nearly all of them, had gathered to watch in awe and curiosity. None present could have foreseen that this single moment would ignite one of the most profound psychological upheavals of the 20th century. The unraveling of Nazi ideology, undone not by argument, but by the overwhelming spectacle of American industrial might. The outcome of Allied victory was being calculated less through battlefield maneuvers than through production figures, statistics that would soon dismantle every certainty these soldiers held about their adversaries, their homeland, and the very cause for which they fought. The unraveling had started weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, when General Jürgen von Arnim, who had stepped in after Rommel's departure, surrendered with an estimated 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The precise count shifted as isolated units laid down arms in the following days. Among those captured were the Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert veterans, men who had once driven the British all the way back to Egypt, and had earned even Montgomery's reluctant respect, now reduced to prisoners. Among them stood Feldman Friedrich Radke, decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the French campaign, and twice wounded during the grueling battles of North Africa. Decades later, his recovered diary in the U.S. National Archives would offer historians one of the most vivid and detailed portraits of how American captivity reshaped the German soldier's mind. That transformation began in Oran, Algeria, where Radke and roughly 30,000 other prisoners lingered in hastily constructed camps, awaiting transport ships. It was there that the relentless precision of American organization first began to erode their long-held assumptions. The U.S. Army handled the intake of thousands of prisoners each day with a level of organization that outstripped even the Wehrmacht at the height of its strength. Every man was photographed for an identity card, his details meticulously filed. Medical examinations were carried out, vaccinations administered, and, perhaps most astonishing of all, the terms of the Geneva Convention were explained in fluent German by American officers trained for precisely this purpose. Yet, the first true shock came not from paperwork, but from the meals. Oberrichter Hans Müher, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would write to his mother 8 months later that in the holding cages at Oran, while they waited for transport ships, the Americans had fed them better than they had eaten in half a year of desert fighting. White bread, actual coffee, meat served twice a day. At first they assumed it was a staged display of propaganda, a calculated performance to win them over. Only later did they understand this was nothing more than the standard American military ration. The ships that would ferry them to captivity were themselves revelations. The Liberty vessels, such as the SS Robert E. Peary, constructed in an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, were feats of industrial engineering so audacious they would have been dismissed as fabrications had German soldiers heard of them beforehand. At the production peak, 3 of these ships slid into the water each day. After delivering critical supplies to the European front, they returned across the Atlantic carrying human cargo instead of running empty, transporting as many as 30,000 prisoners of war each month by the summer of 1943. For those aboard, the 2-week crossing in July marked the next stage in the dismantling of their old beliefs, a quiet but relentless demolition of Nazi ideology carried out not with guns, but with sheer industrial abundance. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division preserved his impressions in letters that survived long after the war and were read by his family upon his return. What shocked him most during the Atlantic crossing was not the sea itself, but the sheer scale of American excess. Each day he observed the crew discarding more food than his company had seen in an entire week during the desperate final months in Africa. He described sailors tossing aside half-eaten steaks, entire loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had simply sat too long. It was not done with malice or arrogance. It was done casually, without second thought, because to the Americans such waste carried no weight. Their supply seemed endless. For the German prisoners, the Liberty ship itself became an education in industrial power. They learned their vessel was only one of 2,010 to be built over the course of the war, each requiring 250,000 individual parts drawn from factories across 32 states. Talkative guards explained that the massive engines were pieced together from components manufactured in 3 different plants, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders, then assembled in port facilities that had scarcely existed 2 years earlier. To men raised on the legend of German efficiency, it was an unsettling revelation. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, descendant of a Prussian family whose lineage stretched back to Frederick the Great, later recalled in his memoirs the moment his doubts crystallized. As their ship neared the American coast, he watched the radar antenna sweep in steady rotation above the bridge. Technology he had believed limited to Germany and perhaps the British was here fitted as routine equipment on a simple cargo vessel. In that instant, he wrote, I realized the war was already lost. On August 2, 1943, at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the prisoners set eyes on America itself, and the last fragile illusions of Nazi propaganda about American weakness collapsed for good. The Norfolk Naval Base unfolded before the prisoners like a city unto itself, sprawling across 4,300 acres with piers that reached into the water for miles. Towering cranes swung constantly, lifting and lowering cargo with a rhythm that never faltered, as dozens of ships were loaded or emptied at once. In a single day, this one port processed more tonnage than Hamburg, the pride of Germany's shipping industry, could manage in an entire week. Gerrit Johan Vifber, who had worked in a Ruhr factory before being drafted, discreetly tallied 47 cargo vessels in various stages of loading or unloading. In his secret diary, he marveled at the cranes themselves, noting how each lifted weights that in Germany would have required a dozen men and teams of horses. These machines moved without pause, powered by electricity, free of the coal smoke that blanketed German industrial towns. From the docks, the prisoners were assembled into neat columns and marched toward the waiting trains. On the way, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging not to officers or party members, but to dock workers. For men raised in a land where private car ownership remained the privilege of the elite, the sight was astonishing. The much-vaunted Volkswagen, promised to the people since 1934, had remained little more than a propaganda fantasy, with fewer than 1,000 delivered. Yet here, ordinary laborers drove themselves to work. Still, the greatest shock awaited at the rail yard. Instead of the cramped cattle cars or the 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses that had carried German troops across Europe, they boarded full passenger trains. Pullman coaches with padded seats that folded into berths, dining cars dressed with white linens and gleaming silverware, observation cars with sweeping windows. We boarded like tourists, not prisoners, Headman Rodka later wrote. Even the American guards, he observed, seemed faintly embarrassed by the luxury their captives were about to enjoy. One American sergeant, almost apologetic, remarked that the air conditioning in their rail car wasn't functioning properly. Air conditioning in August, something the prisoners had believed existed only in Hitler's private train, was being offered to them as though it were routine. For many, the 3-day journey from Norfolk across Virginia, the Carolinas, and onward to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would dismantle Nazi ideology more completely than any battlefield loss. As the train rolled south and west, the men crowded the windows, pressed close to the glass, staring at an America they had been told could not exist. Small towns like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro appeared as if draped in constellations, every street alight, every storefront illuminated, neon signs glowing, houses burning light in multiple rooms long after dark. For soldiers who had grown accustomed to blackout orders and the rationed flicker of a single bulb, the sight was disorienting. Factories along the tracks operated at full strength even at midnight, their windows glowing with activity, parking lots packed with cars. Oberrichter Muir, whose father had been a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, later wrote in a letter unearthed in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Each seemed to possess more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. When guards told him this was nothing unusual, that every American town had been electrified since the 1920s, he scoffed and accused them of lying. The guards simply shrugged and said he would see for himself." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train halted for water and coal. The prisoners watched as railway crews refueled and serviced the train in just 30 minutes, a task that would have consumed 2 hours back home. Automated coal loaders dumped tons of fuel with precision. Electric pumps filled the water tanks. Mechanized systems lubricated wheels and axles. Yet, perhaps most jarring of all was not the machinery, but the men who worked it, American laborers in sturdy leather boots. Footwear so fine it would have cost a German worker 2 months' wages, worn here as little more than everyday attire. They drank Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, tossing the empties into bins without hesitation. Cigarettes burned constantly between their fingers, often discarded half-smoked, as though they had no value at all. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, once an electrical engineer at Siemens, quietly calculated as the train idled in a rail yard that the electricity consumed there in a single hour exceeded the daily use of his entire district in Berlin. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote later. Lights blazed in empty buildings, electric fans spun in unoccupied rooms, all of it a casual disregard born of limitless supply. As the trains pushed deeper into Tennessee and Kentucky, the scale of American industry revealed itself in ways no propaganda could disguise. Outside their windows, factory after factory appeared, each dwarfing anything the men had seen in Germany. In Tennessee, the Alcoa aluminum plant sprawled for 3 miles along the river, its massive furnaces devouring 175,000 kilowatts of electricity, greater than the consumption of the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the pace slowed as the prisoners caught sight of Rubbertown, an industrial complex that had risen from farmland in just 18 months. 4 colossal facilities stood there, each employing thousands, together producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber a year. The comparison was devastating. Germany, though pioneer of the very process, had never achieved more than 120,000 tons in its most productive year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist trained at IG Farben, grasped the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he admitted, "I knew those plants. I knew what they meant. And in that moment, I realized the war was already unwinnable." From his window seat, Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann recalled later, "I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had ever constructed, and there were 4 of them clustered here, with dozens more said to exist across the country." The train pressed northward, and soon the prisoners glimpsed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, its vast silhouette visible from miles away. This immense factory, raised in only 9 months, was a marvel of scale and speed. Within its 2.5 million square feet of floor space, 42,000 workers produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, an astonishing rhythm of assembly supported by 1,550,000 individual parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors spread across the nation. Its appetite for electricity exceeded that of the entire German city of Cologne. Feldwebel Hartmann Wehrli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down in Tunisia, pressed his face against the glass, straining to take it in. He counted no fewer than 17 B-24s in various stages of construction, their wings glinting beneath the factory lights. They had been told again and again that American aircraft were inferior, rushed into existence, doomed to fall apart in combat. But what Wehrli saw was the opposite: precise assembly lines, flawless materials, and a scale of production Germany could not hope to match. These machines were not inferior. They were built with a speed and abundance beyond imagination. As the trains pushed deeper into the heartland, the collapse of Nazi mythology became total. In St. Louis, the prisoners crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Far below, barges moved steadily through the current, carrying more grain than Germany's entire 1942 harvest. Along both banks stood endless grain elevators, each one vast enough to sustain a German city for months. The sight reduced propaganda to ash, replaced by the inescapable truth of American plenty. Oberstabsarzt, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, Chief Surgeon of the 164th Light Division, was stunned to find himself working in a hospital better outfitted than most German civilian facilities. Here, prisoners had access to X-ray machines, fully stocked surgical suites, and an abundance of pharmaceuticals that had been scarce in Germany since 1941. Even more astonishing was the presence of penicillin, a drug so advanced it had reached German doctors only in rumor. They used it freely, Bauer would later testify, even for prisoners with minor infections. While German soldiers died from the lack of simple sulfa drugs, the Americans gave us their most precious medicine without hesitation. Beyond the hospital, the camp kitchen revealed another lesson in abundance. Prisoners assigned to food preparation encountered technology they had never imagined in such scale. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of producing meals for 5,000 men at a time. The rations themselves were equally shocking. Fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread were served daily, quantities German civilians had not seen since before the war began in 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, confessed in his notes, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just surplus. By regulation, 10% extra must always be prepared to guarantee every prisoner receives a full portion. The rest is discarded. I wept as I threw good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, America's growing shortage of farm labor opened yet another chapter in this education by excess. Thousands of prisoners of war were assigned to work in fields and factories, their daily tasks immersing them even deeper into the machinery of American prosperity. The policy of sending prisoners into the fields and factories of America, born out of sheer necessity, achieved what no propaganda campaign could have accomplished. It dismantled the foundations of Nazi ideology with simple, undeniable reality. Each day, groups of captured soldiers were loaded onto trucks and driven openly through the American heartland. No blindfolds, no restricted routes, nothing concealed. They saw it all. Vast fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, factories humming day and night in 3 continuous shifts, shops brimming with goods, parking lots crowded with cars, and homes equipped with refrigerators and radios as common features. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unreitzia Herbert Lang stood in stunned silence as a single machine processed in 1 hour what his entire village could not have managed in a month with hand labor. That gin drew its power from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that by 1943 had brought electricity to 90% of Texas farms. Lang noted bitterly that the farmer who owned the machine was no aristocrat, no party official, just an ordinary man. Yet his household had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including black laborers whom Nazi ideology had dismissed as inferior, opened lunchboxes filled with more food than German workers saw in a week. And this was normal, Lang recorded. Every farm they passed reflected the same abundance. In Nebraska, prisoners set to work in the sugar beet fields witnessed machines that rewrote their understanding of agriculture. A single combine harvester, they were told, could do the labor of 100 men. A demonstration of efficiency that left them shaken and silent. The farmland seemed endless, stretching out in every direction until it dissolved into the horizon, each field larger than entire counties back in Germany. Farmers spoke of harvests with an ease that bordered on casual boasting, yields of 60 bushels of wheat per acre, double what the best German soil could produce even in its finest years. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, assigned to a farm near Scottsbluff, recorded his astonishment. The farmer's son, a boy no older than 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When I remarked on it, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting on a new John Deere model that would be better still. For Hoffman, the words stung more deeply than any battlefield defeat. Yet the most devastating blows to Nazi conviction came not in the fields, but in the factories. While the Geneva Convention barred prisoners from direct war production, they could be assigned to industries that indirectly supported the effort, freeing American workers for the front lines. This loophole meant thousands of Germans came face to face with the very machinery of American prosperity. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, they watched with disbelief as production lines processed more tomatoes in a single day than many German plants could manage in a month. What unsettled them most was that the plant ran not on the muscle of young men, but on the steady hands of women and the elderly, its primary workforce while the nation's youth fought abroad. And still, production outpaced peacetime levels in Germany, a truth impossible to reconcile with the lies they had once believed. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who before the war had worked in a German food processing plant, left one of the most striking accounts of what he witnessed. Everything was automated, he noted with disbelief. Electric conveyor belts carried produce, automatic fillers sealed cans in perfect rhythm. Steam cookers processed hundreds at once. A single elderly woman sat at the controls, her task reduced to turning dials and watching gauges, work that, in Germany, would have required 50 men. She did it leisurely, sipping coffee and listening to a radio as the machines roared around her. Near Detroit, another group of prisoners assigned to unload coal caught sight of the River Rouge complex across the water, a symbol of American industrial might in wartime. Employing 100,000 workers, the plant churned out jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks, its appetite for electricity reaching 1.5 million kilowatts daily, greater than the consumption of the entire city of Hamburg. What shocked the prisoners most was not only the production scale, but the casual wealth surrounding it. Oberrichter Franz Kellner recorded his astonishment at the parking lots. Thousands of cars lined row upon row, all belonging to factory workers. In Germany, even officers counted themselves fortunate to own a car. Yet here guards casually remarked that many workers possessed two, one for work, another for family. The Germans assumed this was a cruel joke, but it was true. By the winter of 1943, the steady accumulation of such revelations produced what American intelligence officers quietly termed ideological collapse syndrome. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program under the Provost Marshal General's office, documented a rising tide of requests from German prisoners eager for access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials, seeds of doubt sprouting into transformation. Major Paul Noland, part of the intelligence team tasked with monitoring prisoner morale, filed a report in December 1943 that captured the change with clinical precision. The prisoners no longer argue when presented with production figures. They have witnessed too much. Even the most ardent Nazis have fallen silent. They remain loyal to Germany, but they no longer speak of victory. Many now question what they were taught about America. This shift soon appeared in the camp newspapers, produced by the prisoners themselves. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, had once echoed with strident nationalism. But by late 1943, its pages turned toward debates on democracy, economic theory, and the shape of post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully chosen anti-Nazi inmates, found their readership not only willing to listen, but eager for such discussions. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, expressed it bluntly in a letter that slipped past American censors. We were told that America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, ruled by Jews, incapable of real military strength. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals, yet perhaps the most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from an unlikely direction: the treatment of Italy's captured soldiers after the armistice of September 1943. Italians who agreed to cooperate with the Allies were reorganized into Italian service units, granted better housing, higher pay, and expanded freedoms, a stark contrast that German prisoners could not fail to notice. German prisoners watched in disbelief as their former Italian allies, now reorganized into Italian service units, moved freely among Americans, working alongside them, eating in restaurants, even courting American women. Feldman Friedrich Schultz captured the humiliation in his diary. The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better now than we ever treated them as allies. They work openly, earn wages, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system. The most profound blow, however, came at Christmas 1943. Across the United States, churches, civic groups, and charitable organizations gathered 500,000 Christmas parcels for German prisoners, men who had been killing American soldiers only months earlier. Inside the boxes were cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and small games. Communities extended invitations for prisoners to join family dinners, though regulations rarely allowed it. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the Methodist Church choir performed Christmas carols in German, their voices carrying across the barracks. Women from the town sent homemade cookies and cakes, while Boy Scouts delivered handcrafted cards adorned with holiday wishes. For men raised on Nazi racial dogma, such gestures were devastating. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose own brother had been killed in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote with raw astonishment, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons or husbands still fighting us, yet they show us Christian charity." This is not propaganda, it is real kindness. What kind of people treat their enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory, secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself bordered on surreal, tables groaning under roast turkey and ham, mashed potatoes drowning in gravy, vegetables, pies, even ice cream. Quantities of food not seen in Germany since before the First World War. The prisoners gorged themselves until they were ill, unable to grasp how such abundance could be poured out upon enemies. Feldwebel Hans A. recorded in disbelief, "We ate like kings. Better than German generals, better than party leaders." And they told us this was nothing extraordinary, just an ordinary American Christmas meal. Every family in this country was eating the same feast. If they feed us like this, what must their own soldiers be receiving at the front? By the opening months of 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were taking part in organized educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and the sciences. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses, while professors from Stanford traveled to deliver lectures on democracy and economics. The hunger for learning proved as intense as their hunger for food. Men raised to believe Americans were uncultured barbarians found themselves surrounded by libraries holding millions of books, universities open to every social class, and research institutions leading the world in scientific discovery. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints on politics and society, a freedom unimaginable under Nazi rule. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later reflected, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without bitterness. They spoke of science as universal, a pursuit that belonged not to one nation, but to all of humanity. They were stunned to realize that American research was not only years ahead of their own, but that knowledge was shared even with captured enemies. To men raised under Nazi ideology, such generosity was incomprehensible. In the camp theaters, prisoners were shown American films, not crude propaganda, but standard Hollywood productions. They watched Gone with the Wind, a sweeping tale of defeat and recovery that echoed their own collapse in captivity. They saw The Grapes of Wrath and could scarcely believe that Americans would permit such raw self-criticism to be screened for the world, much less for enemy soldiers. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer in amazement. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would have meant death." Here it is considered patriotic. By spring of 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded alongside America's surging war production. Germans worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, their daily tasks immersing them in the machinery of industry on a scale they had never imagined. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they unloaded steel destined to become the landing craft for the coming invasion of Europe. There, they watched assembly lines produce 700 boats per month, each requiring 20,000 parts, all fitted together with flawless efficiency. The factory employed 20,000 workers, among them thousands of women who operated cranes, welded holes, and supervised production lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote in disbelief, "Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drill presses, everything we had been told was impossible in a democracy." Yet production never faltered for a moment. The Higgins factory ran without pause, 3 shifts a day, 24 hours, 7 days a week, turning out more landing craft in a single month than the entire Kriegsmarine could produce in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed another level of industrial force. 10,000 tons of steel poured daily from furnaces that never cooled, supplied by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The sheer magnitude defied their understanding. This one plant alone surpassed the entire Ruhr at its peak, noted Oberrichter Paul Hartmann. A former worker at Krupp before the war, Hartmann admitted, "I thought I knew production, but this was beyond imagination." They spilled more steel and waste than we could manufacture. Their workers complained about overtime, while producing volumes we could not match with slave labor and double shifts. By the summer of 1944, it was agriculture that delivered the final, crushing blow to Nazi myths of American weakness. German prisoners spread across the Midwest for harvest season, confronted by yields that seemed to belong to another world. In Kansas, they watched farms so vast that a single operation outproduced entire German provinces. Combines swept across the plains like ships upon a golden sea, each devouring 100 acres in a day. The towering grain elevators that swallowed the harvest held more wheat than Germany had imported in a full year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, could only record his awe. One American farmer, with his machines, does the work of 100 Germans. They showed me aerial photographs, fields of wheat stretching for thousands of square miles. They could lose half their harvest and still feed more people than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, the prisoners were set to work in orchards that seemed endless, row upon row of fruit trees vanishing into the horizon. What shocked them most was not the abundance but the waste. They watched perfectly edible fruit tossed aside for the slightest blemish, fruit that in Germany would have been cherished as a luxury. Sometimes entire harvests were deliberately plowed under to stabilize prices, a concept so alien that it pushed many to the edge of despair. They destroyed food to keep prices steady, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because there were too many. We begged the guards to let us send them home to our families. They were sympathetic, but said it was impossible. The waste itself was proof, strategic proof, that America had resources without limit. Then came June 6, 1944. When word of the Normandy landing swept through the camps, the final illusions shattered. The numbers alone were staggering. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first assault wave. It was an operation on a scale Nazi Germany could not have conceived, let alone matched. At Camp Shelby, the prisoners saw the newsreels within days, watching images of an invasion powered by an industrial machine beyond anything they had imagined. Vast flotillas, floating harbors assembled from nothing. Supply lines that funneled 15,000 tons of materiel across open beaches each day. They saw their homeland being battered by the very nation propaganda had painted as weak, disorganized, incapable of sustained war. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich von Tauben put it starkly in his notes. We knew then that all was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the greatest industrial power on earth with fairy tales and racial myths. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their endless resources. Throughout captivity, German prisoners encountered something that unsettled them more deeply than the sight of America's factories or farms: American humanity. Nazi propaganda had portrayed the enemy as weak, sentimental, incapable of discipline. Yet the prisoners discovered a people so confident in their strength that they could afford mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Müller received word that his son had been killed in the bombing of Hamburg, the camp commander himself delivered the Red Cross message and expressed personal condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children back in Germany, American church groups organized food parcels and sent them across the Atlantic to civilians in a country their own bombers were striking. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, recalled Feldwebel Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not the Germans. At first this seemed like propaganda, but it proved to be genuine. They were preparing us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to annihilate it. Nowhere was this more evident than in medicine. German doctors worked side by side with American staff, gaining access to equipment and techniques that were far beyond what they had known at home. Prisoners received surgeries that, in Germany, would have been reserved only for the privileged few. Even mental health care, virtually unheard of in the Wehrmacht, was offered freely. Dr. Friedrich Bauer marveled. They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Men who broke under strain received therapy, not beatings. For soldiers shaped by a regime that prized brutality, this compassion was perhaps the most disorienting revelation of all. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we had never understood, the quiet confidence of true power, one prisoner later reflected. By March 1945, the secret re-education program was yielding results beyond anything its designers had imagined. More than 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in democracy courses. Camp newspapers that once echoed with Nazi rhetoric now printed essays on constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future, not in terms of conquest, but of rebuilding a society on new foundations. Men who had arrived as hardened ideologues were drafting essays on democratic reform. Officers who had once sworn unbreakable oaths to Hitler now spoke of bringing American agricultural methods home to transform German farming. We became missionaries for democracy, admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, unrelated to the Reichsmarschall, in a 1975 interview, not because of coercion or propaganda, but because we saw it work. We saw ordinary Americans living better than German aristocrats. We wanted that for our people. The transformation became so thorough that American officials quietly worried some prisoners had become too enamored of American life. Requests to remain in the United States multiplied. A few even married American women they had met through correspondence programs. In the 1950s, thousands would eventually immigrate, carrying their memories of captivity into new lives. Then, in April 1945, came the final revelation. As Allied troops liberated concentration camps across Germany, the films were screened for the POWs. At first, many refused to believe, dismissing the images as enemy invention, but the evidence was irrefutable, and with it, the last remnants of denial collapsed into silence. Testimony from American soldiers, photographic evidence, newsreels, and eventually letters from relatives back home confirmed the unthinkable reality of the concentration camps. The psychological blow was immense. For many who had clung to a fragile pride in German honor despite battlefield defeat, this revelation was the final collapse, proof not only of failure, but of moral corruption. Everything they had endured, everything they had believed, was exposed as not merely misguided, but monstrous. Oberleutnant Walter Schmidt captured it in stark words. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization truly meant. By May 1945, as the war ground to its conclusion, German prisoners faced the prospect of repatriation with conflicted emotions. They had lived through an America that overturned every certainty they had carried into captivity. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had received more dignity and compassion from their captors than from their own leaders. In those final months, American officials began preparing them for return to a shattered homeland. Camps offered vocational training, modern agricultural instruction, and political education. Prisoners even heard of the Marshall Plan before it was public, realizing that America intended not to destroy Germany, but to rebuild it. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tobin. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens. For men raised under a system steeped in vengeance, this generosity from victors seemed beyond comprehension. Yet between 1945 and 1946, some 371,683 German prisoners of war were repatriated from American camps, returning to a homeland in ruins, divided, devastated, and destitute. What they carried back, however, was more than memories of captivity. They brought with them the living proof of how a democratic, industrial society could function at full strength. These men, once the instruments of Nazi conquest, became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency harnessed without tyranny, agricultural abundance achieved without exploitation, prosperity created through democracy rather than oppression. They knew that reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had already accomplished it. Many former prisoners went on to play critical roles in shaping West Germany's future. Hans Kroll, once interned at Camp Shelby, rose to become West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught courses at Camp Kearney, became the first president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Maris, held at Camp Herne, later served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, once a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in agricultural reform. Together, they carried American methods into German industry, American efficiency into German farming, and American democratic ideals into the political foundations of a reborn nation. The economic miracle that lifted West Germany in the 1950s owed much to knowledge first absorbed in American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll reflected in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers with dignity increased production. These were lessons forged not in lecture halls alone, but in daily observation of American life. Historians have since described the German POW experience in the United States as one of the most successful re-education programs in modern history. It worked without coercion, without the blunt instruments of traditional propaganda. Instead, it relied on exposure, allowing men who had once sworn to Hitler to see, taste, and live within a society that contradicted everything they had been taught. They witnessed factories operating at a scale that made German industry look archaic, farms producing surpluses that mocked Nazi promises of Lebensraum, and a standard of living that revealed the party's ideology as fantasy. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the foremost historian of the subject, summed it up simply. America won the propaganda war not with slogans, but with reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity. The statistics bear this out. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,222 total attempts recorded. Post-war surveys revealed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent, a striking testament to the quiet power of abundance, dignity, and democratic confidence. Most remarkable of all, thousands of former prisoners maintained correspondence with American families long after the war ended. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of Germany's surrender, over 500 surviving POWs returned to the United States for a reunion in Austin, Texas, many bringing children and grandchildren to see the place where their transformation had begun. Former Oberrichter Hans Vea, once held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, who later settled in Georgetown, Maine, as a physician, addressed the gathering. Life in the camps was, for many of us, better than what we had known at home. We grew up in cold water flats in Germany, but in America, we discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. More importantly, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meir, who had spent his captivity working on farms in Iowa, recalled, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared meals, their knowledge, sometimes even their homes. This humanity, from families whose sons were fighting against us, changed us forever." That night at the reunion dinner, the keynote address fell to former Oberst Hermann Gutz, then 78 years old. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had lived both sides of history. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. Oberst Hermann Gutz declared, his voice resonating through the hall. America showed us that real strength does not come from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy in full force. We saw farmers producing food for the world, workers building the tools of victory, and citizens who treated even their enemies with dignity. We came to understand that America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its tanks, but its boundless capacity to create and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that creates instead of destroys, that prospers through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons first learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies now turned friends, thank you for showing us the way. His words brought the auditorium to its feet, a thunderous standing ovation uniting Americans and Germans alike. Once bitter enemies, now bound in recognition of a transformation that had seemed unthinkable when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The scale of the German POW experience in America can be understood through the sheer logistics of the system. More than 500 camps were constructed across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, with 175 principal camps and 325 branch facilities. Each camp was built to house between 250 and 12,000 men, often completed in as little as 90 days. In total, 371,683 German prisoners passed through American custody, part of a broader total of 425,171 Axis captives. At the peak in May 1945, the system held its largest population, fueled by staggering intake rates, an average of 20,000 arrivals per month in 1943, climbing to 30,000 per month after D-Day, and surging to 60,000 monthly in the final desperate months of the war. The numbers themselves told the story of a quiet but decisive victory. German prisoners contributed 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, processed 100 million board feet of lumber, and generated an estimated $230 million in labor value, at a time when their daily wage was set at 80 cents, according to 1940 standards. They filled critical shortages in 46 states, sustaining American farms and industries during the war's peak demands. Escapes were vanishingly rare. Out of more than 371,000 prisoners, only 2,222 attempts were recorded, a mere 0.6%, and none succeeded permanently. Most escapees were recaptured within a day, and not a single American civilian was harmed. The educational programs proved equally significant. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in formal courses. Some 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 men studied English. 15,000 learned trades through vocational training, and 8,000 pursued university-level correspondence courses. After the war, the impact endured. Roughly 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the United States. More than 12,000 kept up correspondence with American families, on average for 31 years, and many returned as tourists, scholars, or business partners. The judgment of captivity was overwhelmingly positive. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% admitted their worldview had been changed for the better. 61% expressed a genuine interest in democracy. Fewer than 1 in 10 clung to Nazi beliefs by 1945. These men had not merely been confined. They had been exposed to the living reality of a system that thrived on freedom, diversity, and productivity. Their imprisonment became an education, their defeat an enlightenment, their captivity a liberation from ideological chains. In the end, America's greatest triumph was not on the battlefield, but within the prison camps, where democratic prosperity achieved what no army could: the transformation of enemy minds. The prisoners had entered captivity convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They departed knowing the opposite was true. America's industrial strength had not only surpassed them, it defied comprehension for men shaped by scarcity, hierarchy, and tyranny. The trains that carried them into Texas in 1943 had been filled with warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that bore them home in 1946 returned with men who would help build a new democracy. They had glimpsed the future, and it was functioning before their eyes. Their journey remains a testament to a profound reality. America's most devastating weapon was never its arsenal of tanks, planes, or bombs, but the undeniable evidence of what a free society could create in abundance. German prisoners were astonished by American production, but in the end, it was that very abundance that remade them. Within their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war rebirth and the final death of the Nazi vision. They returned not merely as defeated soldiers, but as witnesses to what freedom and democracy could accomplish. The economic miracle that rebuilt West Germany in the 1950s stood on foundations first laid in American prison camps, where men learned that prosperity grew not from conquest, but from liberty, not from racial supremacy, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian command, but from democratic cooperation. The German prisoners had arrived on American soil, expecting to find a fractured, fragile nation teetering on collapse. Instead, they encountered an industrial giant of limitless power and, more astonishing still, a society capable of extending humanity even to its enemies. They came as captives of war, but departed as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its zenith. In their awe at America's abundance were planted the psychological seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic rebirth of Germany. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and they would never be the same. Their children would grow up in a Germany rebuilt on democratic principles, bound in partnership with the very nation they had once fought against. That alliance was born from a transformation that began quietly in June 1943, when 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and discovered that everything they had believed was false. The saga of German POWs in America is, at its heart, a story of redemption through revelation. It demonstrates that the greatest victories need not be forged in destruction, but can be won through demonstration, not by propaganda, but by prosperity, not by hatred, but by humanity. Those German soldiers who saw America's industrial might firsthand returned as unexpected emissaries of democracy, carrying with them the seeds of renewal that would grow into one of history's most remarkable national reconstructions. Their passage from loyal soldiers of Nazism to committed citizens of democracy stands as one of the most extraordinary transformations of the modern age. It was achieved not through coercion, but through the undeniable proof of what a free people could build when united in purpose. That was America's true secret weapon, not merely the unmatched ability to turn out tanks and aircraft in greater numbers than any rival, but the quiet power to turn enemies into allies through the example of prosperity, freedom, and dignity. The German prisoners were astonished by America's industrial might, but it was the change within themselves that carried the promise of a better world.